So just, okay. So thanks for coming, people. And so I think many of you know Erin, but she's working at UNB St. John this term, teaching European history and history of medicine and health, right, Erin? Yeah, yeah. And in the fall, you were helping to teach one of the Bachelor of Health courses.
Yeah, their foundation course,
Yeah.
current and future trends in health. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a new program at UNB St. John. It's just maybe the first or second year. And so some of our history courses, I think, and political science courses as well are, I think, kind of towards that program. So it'd be interesting to see how the program builds out. So yeah, so Erin, and this research you're talking on tonight is kind of stems from your doctoral work as well a bit, doesn't it? Or is it something?
Yeah, it's an offshoot of that.
Yeah, great. And you did I should know all this, fresh in my mind, but you did, was it all 3 degrees at UNB or 2?
No, I did my undergrad honors and a master's at UNB in Fredericton.
That's right.
And then my PhD is from the University of Saskatchewan.
Saskatchewan, yes, that's right. Yeah, okay. Well, great. Well, I'll turn things over to Erin. I'm going to turn my camera off. Just remind people to try to keep your cameras and mics off until the Q&A. And we'll let's see here. Looking forward to this, and we will see you in a bit. Erin, you can share your slides now.
Oh, it's doing, sorry.
It's okay.
I have to go back into settings and.
Okay, or hit slideshow.
Yeah, it keeps wanting to revert back to being
right.
Not good. I don't know why we all see. Do you see many things?
I see the before you hit slideshow, I'm seeing your first, when you go into PowerPoint, it would be your first screen before you hit slideshow on the top.
Okay.
Top, the top toolbar.
Right.
Yeah. What are you seeing?
I'm seeing presenter mode.
Okay.
How did I fix this before? Let's figure this out. Nope. Same thing.
There you go. You're good.
I'm good?
Perfect.
Okay.
Yeah.
The perils of technology. I should not perhaps say that I just came from teaching a digital history class until about 20 to 7. But welcome to Health in Winter, Perceptions of Cold and Medical Treatment at British Army Hospitals in North America, circa 1775 to 1815. And this here is showing a British Army officer and a merchant in Quebec in their winter dress in 1810. And so on August 5th of 1791, the Admiralty granted Mr. John McAvoy, the dispenser of Halifax Naval Hospital, an increased allowance for coals and candles on account of, quote, the hardships he labors under for want of an allowance of fuel in that severe climate. This talk examines why extra supplies were granted to Mr. McAvoy by considering the following: 18th century medical theory and climate, perceptions of and preparations for winter, and also a brief discussion of medical treatment. When considering harsh climates for the British military and naval forces, scholars have tended to focus on the tropical climates of the West Indies and India, where malaria and yellow fever had devastating effects. Less attention has been paid to the effects of cold on hospitals and other military installations in Canada and the region north of Chesapeake Bay, which included New York and Boston. However, military and naval medical practitioners, their governing bodies such as the Admiralty, clearly saw the Canadian climate as harsh and severe, even in comparison to the American Northeast. Such severity meant that hospitals were granted special allowances to defend against the climate so that the institutions and the medical practitioners within them could adequately provide care and cure to the sick and injured. Meanwhile, military encampments and garrisons struggled to keep their soldiers suitably clothed to deal with the realities of winter. So climates that were drastically different than that of Britain struck fear into the minds of British medical practitioners, soldiers, and sailors. The tropical climate and its accompanying diseases devastated British colonists and military personnel alike. On average, only 1/3 of each British regiment sent to a West Indian expedition escaped death by tropical fever in the 18th and early 19th centuries. Unsurprisingly, maintaining the health of servicemen in the region was a high priority for British governments. And here you can see the fear of yellow fever in this parody cartoon. It's a parody astrological depiction. So what not to do in the West Indies. Naval and military medical practitioners were cognizant of the dangers posed by the West Indian environment. Stuart Henderson opened his a letter to the officers of the army under orders for, or that may hereafter be sent to the West Indies with a distressing message. Gentlemen, from the repeated melancholy account received from the last 12 months from that part of the world which you are now destined to, not only of the great mortality which has happened among the privates, but the officers have no doubt impressed your mind with ideas of the country and your situation. Not of the most pleasant nature, but this may have one good effect, by making you listen more attentively to the means pointed out for preventing this fatal disease, which has proved so destructive to so many of our brave countrymen, and at the same time induce you to be more inclined not to neglect prevention, which I am convinced is greatly within your power. Henderson's work was a generally alarmist text, and went on to state that, quote, these islands have been emphatically and often too justly styled the grave of the British Army. But I believe at no period since their discovery has that been so strongly verified as of late. Hector McLean, the assistant inspector of hospitals at St. Domingo, described the situations having, quote, filled the minds of everyone with terror and astonishment. McLean and Henderson's profound concern over the health of soldiers in the torrid region was not new. Rather, their concerns were magnified by the loss of the 13 colonies in 1783, which made the West Indies the largest battleground in the Americas. And you can see this is Johnny Newcomb to the island of Jamaica, and it's a cartoon series of this new Englishman who arrives in Jamaica, and it ends with his death from yellow fever. And you can see his display in the casket, and then the caskets piled up in the street in the last image there. So while the West Indies may have been the largest battleground, it was not the only one wherein war was waged in climatic extremes. The environment of North America was also seen as inhospitable, even if it did not instill fear in the British and colonial populations like that of the West Indies. Yet the North American climate, particularly the region north of the Chesapeake into Canada, did generate concerns for medical practitioners. The primary concerns in this region and the main hindrances to medical practice were climatic extremes. In this way, many military medical practitioners echoed the experiences of 17th and 18th century colonists. Historian Sam White explains that Henry Hudson's voyages at the beginning of the 17th century brought back, quote, new descriptions of extreme Arctic cold to Europe. While these comparisons were countered by seasonal experiences with temperate New England summers, colonists needed to experience the hardships of winter in order to more accurately describe the climate of the region. In assessing the failure of the Pompey colony in northern Maine, White describes, quote, the freezing winter was, if hardly the only reason for the colony's failure, still a crucial factor behind so much that went wrong during the Pompey colony's brief existence. As the details of the harshness of winter became ingrained in the climatic perceptions of the region, it became increasingly difficult to attract colonists. Throughout the second half of the 18th century, British imperial agents described the weather in New England and Nova Scotia as comparatively harsh, excessive, extreme, intense, rigorous, bitter, and severe. Indeed, Nova Scotia was often compared with Georgia as representative of British colonies with, quote, extreme climates. For military medical practitioners, winter brought numbing and dangerous cold, while summer in the same regions could be oppressively and debilitatingly hot. Yet it was only in the climate of Canada and the northern 13 colonies that hospitals needed to be constructed to withstand harsh winter temperatures.
Yes, yeah, the books. Yeah, you do the books. Yes, that's right. I just sent it today. Yes.
Yes, harsh winter temperatures, but they still needed to be well ventilated in the heat of summer. This was of great concern when the most vulnerable to harsh climates were sick and wounded military personnel. Within 18th century medicine, both environment and climate played a role in either helping or hindering medical recovery. All bodies were held to have an individual constitution. This constitution was based on the environment and the climate in which that particular body developed. For instance, there were general characteristics that were believed to make up the English Constitution, the Scottish Constitution, the Irish Constitution, and so on, while bodies could also be influenced by urban or rural environments. For those colonists born in New England, the climate was seen as beneficial by both colonists and medical practitioners. However, that did not change the danger such a region presented to strangers or newcomers. Belief in constitutional climatic acclimatization was one reason why a Georgian loyalist feared the move from Georgia and being, quote, frozen to death once arriving in Halifax. By the time of the American Revolution, remarking on the differences between cold and hot climates was so common as to be hardly mentioned in William Fordyce's 1773, A New Inquiry into the Causes, Symptoms, and Cure of Putrid and Inflammatory Fevers. And I apologize for the very long quote here. In this commercial country, everyone has heard of the difference between hot and cold climates, of the unwholesomeness of some of our East and West India settlements, of the different effects of heat and cold on our bodies, how much the same substances tend to be more of a less putrid state according to the nature of the climate or the season of the year. The Canadian, who kills his game for winter provision at the setting in of the frost, can depend upon its freshness until the heat of returning spring warms him of its changing to a different state. While the inhabitant of Kingston in Jamaica or Havana in the island of Cuba knows that what is killed must be eaten in 30 hours if he wishes it to be fresh. To have hinted at the influence of climate on our bodies on all animal substances will be sufficient to show what attention is due from both the physician and the patient to ward of their pernicious effects. Writing in 1798, military surgeon William Blair believed that the experience with various climates made the soldiers move more easy from one climate to another. The employment of a soldier obliges him to be abroad in all seasons. Habit therefore endures him to many changes which to others would be fatal. But there are precautions to be taken against unhealthy seasons or situations, of which it behooves him not to be ignorant. The effects produced by the weather on living bodies principally depend on its degree of heat or cold. Experience, however, has shown that health may be preserved even during considerable extremities of heat or cold, provided the weather be dry. The combination of heat or cold with moisture is the chief source of disease. And we all know that the weather in the Maritimes is certainly not dry. And also this on the side, this is from Robert Boyle's experiments with temperature, testing various kinds of thermometers, and it's from 1683. So while experience could not prevent or lessen the dangers of the moist, cold Canadian winter, that remained the duty of medical and naval practitioners in their various establishments. So perceptions of and preparations for winter, and this is ice boats crossing the Northumberland Strait in the second half of the 19th century, but it was the closest depiction I could find to the Northumberland Strait in winter. So as the Army traditionally viewed different regions of the world as separate and distinct climates and attempted to ensure that their medical officers have served in all climates in every station, the Army Medical Board designed this practice to facilitate knowledge acquisition in different parts of the empire, so that medical practitioners could be sent to where there was greatest need. This practice contributed to the delineation of climatic zones and the differences between them regardless of seasonality or the changing of the seasons. This is what historian Suman Seth calls the medical mapping of empire. So therefore, despite warm summers, the Canadian and Northeastern American climates were defined by winter cold and the problems that winter presented. Preparations for a special winter hospital were underway in Montreal in August of 1778 to house 120 or 130 sick in a building rather than a tent. Speaking about an outbreak of dysentery on transport ships in October of 1779, Emil Blaine hoped that the outbreak would, quote, not spread especially as the frosty weather has begun. The winter weather, and in certain cases the accompanying freeze-up, also forced medical practitioners to remain in place until spring, even if they were ordered to go elsewhere. William Barr, a surgeon and the hospital purveyor for the military forces in Canada during the American Revolution, detailed the importance of establishing a winterized hospital at Quebec City in 1778 in a letter to General Guy Carleton, the commander of British forces in Canada. Some few disbursements will be necessary to make the building a good winter hospital. But when your excellency considers that the expense is for the comfort and happiness of the poor sick soldier, I am persuaded the money will no longer be an object with you. Besides, I have to inform you that by having this house fitted up for a winter hospital, you will save to the public the following rents which I have formerly paid. So it's clear that Barr believed that without proper winter facilities, the threat of exposure would hamper the recovery of the sick and wounded. Exposure could also cause further illness and debility through frostbite. These dangers were also recognized by General Carleton, who dispensed the £200 for the provisioning of a winter hospital at Quebec. In October of 1778, a general hospital was established in Halifax. However, this general hospital was quickly abolished in March of the following year to be replaced with a regimental hospital deemed, quote, more economical and equally beneficial. So this opinion was representative of the debate over the ideal way to offer medical treatment in the Army, but it also represented a change in how fuel, blankets, and other winter necessities were to be supplied. The economical decision may have been based in part on the fact that regimental hospitals would be supplied by regimental stores and not those of the garrison or the staff hospital. The inclusion of regimental hospitals within regimental supply systems can be seen in the estimate of the quantity of candles necessary for 40,000 men for the 26 winter weeks from April 20th of 1778. According to the estimate, a regiment consisting of 612 men with the complement of officers will be, according to the present establishment in America, require 75 rooms, and candles will therefore be wanted for 4,900 rooms, which at £1 a week for each room will amount to £127,400, 24,000 pounds of which will be wanted for guards, hospitals, and general officers, making in all 151,400 pounds, 1/3 part of which to be mold candles for the use of the officers, the remainder to be dipped candles, 10 to the pound. And so here you can also see the difference between the good quality candles that the officers are getting and the dipped candles or the tallow candles that you would dip that the general rank and file are getting. So this demonstrates that regimental hospitals were clearly part of the regimental supply system. Additionally, the estimate stated that these candles were to be sent from Ireland for the 1778-1779 winter season. George Clark, the Brigadier Master General, who was based in New York, sought to make up 3/4 of the candle supply needed by the regiments through the purchase of orders in America, as the supplies from Ireland might arrive too late. Thus, even though regimental hospitals had access to the stores of the regiment they served, adequate supplies in these stores were not guaranteed through traditional means of transport from Britain. Winter hospitals required as well adequate fuel for heating. In the instructions for naval hospitals on foreign stations, under which all naval hospitals outside of Haslar and Plymouth in Britain fell, all hospital expenses were to be approved by the Admiralty or the commanding officer before a contract was signed. It is unsurprising that such bureaucratic procedures existed in the Royal Navy, an organization with global reach and severe economic oversight. Nor was the provision to require prior approval for financial expenditure merely bureaucratic. In many instances, surgeons, agents, and commissioners for the sick and hurt did not have enough cash on hand to pay for those items they had contracted for, and would need to rely on a treasury bill granted by the Admiralty or the commanding officer in the port. Yet such procedures did not adapt well to rapid changes in weather that might necessitate increased spending. One such case, when increased supplies were needed, occurred during the 1816 year without summer. According to historian Gillian Darcy Wood, quote, the Canadian subpolar region witnessed its coldest temperatures and greatest ice extent in 120 years of record keeping in the years 1816 and 1817. And this is following the Tabora volcano eruption. It was during this time that Thomas Lewis, the surgeon to the Kingston Naval Hospital, advertised in the Kingston Gazette for firewood to be delivered to his institution. Supplies for firewood or coal would normally have been laid on well before winter set in. The request for an additional 200 cords of wood suggests that the Naval Hospital had already burned through or were close to burning through their entire winter supply of firewood by the beginning of January. However, in a bit of a paradoxical relationship, even in winter, the wards of military and naval hospitals needed to be ventilated in order to ensure an environment free of contagion. Military surgeon Donald Monroe recounted on how he ensured that the military hospital in Bremen, Germany was properly ventilated. Quote, after the fires were lighted in the wards, upon removing the board which covered the hole in the door and opening the little square windows, a current of fresh air rushed into the ward by the door, while the heated, foul air found an exit by the windows. In very cold weather, the opening of small windows was sufficient, but in mild weather and in summer, it was necessary to keep both open. And the background here, there's a series of different mechanical ventilators that were designed by Stephen Hales, and this is from the 1750s. And it's not just medical institutions that require these special ventilation considerations in winter. Ordinary soldiers needed adequate winter uniform in order to preserve their health in harsh climates. Again, Surgeon Monroe, who served in the 7 Years' War in North America, recommended that commanding officers encouraged all their men, quote, to be provided with good strong shoes and stockings, and where the troops remain late in the field, if the government allowed a pair or two extraordinary for each to every foot soldier, it would be of great use to the service. In more extreme and severe winters, Monroe recounted that, quote, it has been found of the greatest service to provide the men with fur or flannel caps with wings, which can be brought down to cover the ears and neck in very cold weather and at night. He further suggested that extra blankets be carried by regimental wagons for use in camp, and that both during this and in the late war, the troops on the North American service have had a pair of trousers or breeches with legs, which reach to their shoes, defending them against cold in winter and against bites of flies, insects, and of serpents in summer. All these provisions necessitated an increasing expenditure by the state. And Monroe's recommendations also illustrate what had become the clear defining figure of medicine in the Canadian climate. The defining characteristic of military medicine in Canada was cold and how to deal with it. Soldiers would not die without long pants in summer, though they did, of course, provide a benefit. But without warm clothes, sturdy shoes, and minimized exposure to the ravages of winter, death could be and was a real possibility. Surgeon of the 1st Regiment of Foot, Thomas Dixon Reed, recounts the comparatively healthy situation of summer at camp around Lake Champlain in 1777, before the arrival of winter and its accompanying dangers. And I won't read the whole thing, but he says, it was a very healthy situation. The weather while we remained in those places was very cold and continued so till the 11th of November, when we were again ordered to Montreal for winter. A very severe frost came on. Many of the men employed in this service were seized with coughs and inflammatory fevers, or had their extremities nipped by the frost. So with the exception of the marshland, the men in Reed's regiment were healthy. It was only after the frost of winter set in that this situation started to change. The best course of action for military commanders during the winter was to provide garrisoned accommodation for their troops. However, such accommodation was costly to construct and to heat. When General Carleton arrived in Nova Scotia in October of 1782, quote, he found the works at Halifax in so bad order as to prevent it putting them in proper condition before the setting in of the inclement season. Carleton had hoped to be able to send coal to Major General Parvison's forces based at Penobscot, but his transport ships had been attacked by the French while under convoy. Since the start of the war, the British had been attempting to extract coal from Spanish River, which is now modern-day Sydney and Cape Breton, in hopes to augment the scant supply of coal that had been shipped from Britain. Wood, though plentiful, was contracted for at exorbitant prices. Clinton wrote to Howe of the scarcity of fuel for the troops at Halifax in October of 1778. It is my duty to inform your excellency of the extreme difficulty we labor under here in procuring a sufficiency of fuel for the winter. The quantity at present in store will not be sufficient for the supply of the troops, should the 2 regiments your excellency mentions your intention of sending come till the middle of January. And it will be hardly possible to lay in any quantity of wood, both from the extreme scarcity and its being risen to the enormous price of 40 shillings the cord. So predicting the impending fuel shortage, 100 rank and file soldiers and their commanding officers have been sent to Spanish River, with 10 transport ships to bring coal back to Halifax. Mansi had informed Clinton in September that the Halifax Deputy Quartermaster General, quote, has pushed on this coal business with rigor in an attempt to secure adequate fuel supplies. Yet at the time of Clinton's letter, quote, the vessels are not returned, but when they do, I'm afraid the assistance they will bring will be much short of what are expected. The uncertainty of whether the coal could be extracted from Spanish River in sufficient time and quantity had a knock-on effect for New York. In March of 1778, General Massey, of the opinion that New York and its dependencies may be fully supplied with wood for fuel by taking proper steps, ordered the garrison forces of New York to, quote, lay in a sufficient quantity during the summer and autumn for at least 10,000 men. Any supplies that could be had over and above this number should be procured and may be wanted for the winter. Massey's decision may have been prescient, for at the same time that Clinton's coal-laden transports were returning, a detachment of men ordered from Spanish River to Charlottetown was shipwrecked on Sable Island, quote, on which they had passed a most distressful and uncomfortable winter. When the weather improved, a small ship's boat departed for Spanish River in order to request a rescue ship. When the military commander, quote, immediately hired a vessel for the release, the ship returned with them in a few days, as also of the crew of another vessel who had been met with the same accident, and the whole amounting to 48 souls. So as this case demonstrates, shipping in the autumn months, the last opportunity to lay in supplies before winter freeze-up, was very dangerous due to storms. Meanwhile, the waters off the coast of Nova Scotia were filled with American privateers. With such a risk of capture and loss of cargo, commanders of hired transports could charge upward of £150 for the short voyage from Spanish River to Halifax. Yet despite the difficulty in mining and transporting coal, the British Army's venture at Spanish River was successful. By May of 1779, 1,200 chaldrons of coal had been mined at Sydney, with the commanding officer at Spanish River predicting that 3,000 chaldrons would be available to be shipped by August. This is more than triple the amount of coal sent from England to the British Army headquarters in New York in 1778. This is far below the needs of headquarters, who also attempted to procure additional fuel supplies needed from Halifax via Spanish River. Clinton directed Major General Massey at Halifax to supply, quote, as much coal as can be sent from Spanish River as can be had. Military preoccupation with the colder climate was not solely due to the health issues the climate posed. Correspondence between military commanders and the headquarters of Major General Howe are filled with discussions of transport issues of men and supplies during the winter months. Dartmouth wrote to Howe on the 5th of September 1775, both complaining about, quote, the great risk and little advantage that we are expected from the armies continuing at Boston during the winter season, and expressing the desire to send 20,000 men to Quebec as early as possible in the spring. With winter travel extremely difficult, troop movements in anticipation of the coming campaign season needed to be completed before the first snow set in. Concerns surrounding transportation to Quebec in the fall and winter months, when the St. Lawrence River could become impassable, also resulted in alternative arrangements to house troops in Halifax. A dispatch to military commanders in Halifax stated that, quote, if the 17th, 46th, and 56th regiments should find passage to Quebec impracticable and put into Halifax, and the 28th, 46th, and 55th regiments should be obliged to remain there without being able to join the army under your command, it is intended that these 4 regiments, together with the 27th, ordered directly to that place, should all go to Quebec as early as possible in the spring. Similar recommendations for delay of troop movements were found in letters from 1777, 78, and 79, with the use of Halifax as a muster point for spring convoys to Quebec. The reliance upon sea transport for troops and the inaccessibility of the St. Lawrence in the winter was therefore a significant issue for the British in the northern theater of the war during the American Revolution. Overland transportation of men and communications was near impossible during the winter, and when it did occur, it was hampered by heavy snow and large distances. The commander of troops stationed in Charlottetown in 1780, Simeon Herthley, petitioned for permission to attend to the affairs of his family in New York during the winter. In evidence to support his request, he noted that he had not heard from his family since the start of the revolution, and that as the island is surrounded by ice in the winter, to prevent any attempts from the enemy, I think my absence cannot be prejudicial to the service. In February of 1781, Barr, the hospital surgeon and purveyor at Trois-Rivières, wrote to Captain Richard Lenarote, the Army Adjutant General, concerning the difficulty of Mr. Menzies to join his regiment. As to Mr. Menzies, who was the care of the sailors at Detroit, it will be impossible for him to join his regiment at this season of the year. I should hope the surgeon's mate will be able to do the duty of the regiment till the spring, when a mate from the hospital can be sent to relieve Mr. Menzies. Although the transportation issues described here may seem minor, they significantly hampered day-to-day operations in the Army and military medical care. The difficulty of transportation of men, supplies, and communications in winter colored the North American climate in the eyes of military commanders and medical practitioners. Canada in particular was unhospitable and difficult to endure in the winter months. Preparations for the coming winter often began when the snow from the previous winter was still on the ground. The War Office in March of 1777 sought from military commanders a list of such articles that they think will be wanted in the course of the campaign or during the winter, which was to be transmitted by their agents at the earliest opportunity. Such advanced planning was necessary to get supplies onto ships heading to North America in the late spring and early summer in order to ensure that they reached the men who needed them. Supplies that arrived in the autumn were of little use to troops stationed outside port towns, and winter supply issues were rampant during the American Revolution. Brigadier General James Hamilton, as well as the commanders of 7 regiments of foot and 1 regiment of Royal Artillery, petitioned Major General Phillips in September of 1778 for supplies that had not yet been received, yet the cost for which had been docked from the man's pay. To supply, in the view of these commanders, not only were their men well overdue for such supplies, but that the current clothing of the men possessed would not be sufficient for winter in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Quote, to supply for the want of clothing, we are also of the opinion that thick double-breasted flannel waistcoat with sleeves and a blanket coat of good quality for each man will be sufficient clothing for winter. To add insult to injury, the supplies requested had been dispatched from England, but had been sent to Quebec, where they remained, while the troops such supplies had been destined for had been redeployed to Massachusetts. The winter clothing supply situation was even more dire for the Hessian regiments, that the British were unwilling to finance requests for supplies without assurances that they would be covered for such costs by the Allied princes. Hessian commander Brigadier General Spricht described the difficulty of the supply situation, how the German troops had come to receive their winter blankets from the British and petitioned for similar supplies to be granted again. When the troops went to the American War in 1776, which is now upwards of 2 years and a half ago, as they passed by England, they received a blanket and a cap each man as a very necessary article in America. Their blankets had been used all last winter and summer, were continually carried upon the soldier's back upon all marches, and by the being so often folded and unfolded, and by so long use, are become almost useless. As the blanket is absolutely necessary for the soldier, and it is not possible that he can purchase it at his own expense, nor can it be expected that the Duke of Brunswick should allow it for the troops, as His Majesty was so gracious as to give it the first time to the men. We dare flatter ourselves that through your means, Sir Henry Clinton will be induced to grant new blankets and caps to the troops. Faced with such supply shortages, being forced to travel overland during the winter was a worst case scenario. As in the case of the retreat, troops were exposed to the harshness of winter weather without adequate clothing and supplies. So cold climates were seen as the means through which inflammatory disorders began. For Monroe, it was, quote, in military hospitals that fluxes were liable to be complicated with other disorders, as well as with malignant fever, especially with coughs and pre-pneumonic symptoms when the weather begins to be cold in October and November. These sorts of inflammatory fevers would be much the same as inflammatory fevers in more temperate climates like Britain. However, frostbite was almost universally described as the disease of the Canadian climate. Monroe recommended that the use of fires to keep soldiers warm. In North America, when the men are filled in very hard, frosty winter, fires were lighted at the ends of the tents, and sentinels set over them to prevent their doing mischief. And both in Germany and North America, when troops were in field without tents, they cut down wood and made large fires, and the soldiers lay down and slept around these fires, with their feet next to them. In conditions such as these, it might seem that medical practitioners would be happy for their regiments to enter winter quarters, or an indoor space. Yet this was not always the case. Quarters meant close proximity, which almost always accompanied another onset of disease. According to Surgeon Robert Hamilton, quote, "In winter and in quarters, we were more sickly, and I am certain that all inflammatory diseases were oftener found in quarters than in the field. This is a matter well deserving mature deliberation." Again, frostbite was the most specific of ailments to the Canadian climate. It appears in no discussion of war on the continent or of encampments in Britain. Monroe recommended the following treatment. Quote, "If a man or any part of his body be benumbed or frostbitten by extreme cold, it is highly dangerous to expose him suddenly to the heat of a fire. The certain consequence of such indiscretion is general or partial death. Life is either extinguished by the sudden transition, or some part becomes livid and mortifies. The safest way is to rub the part affected with snow, or to immerse it in water so cold as to nearly freeze, till its natural heat and color be gradually restored. Small cupfuls of strong, nourishing soup, but not very hot, may be given from time to time internally." So interestingly, this sort of avoiding the shock treatment would not have been out of place with modern first aid techniques. And by the War of 1812, military medical practitioners were malfamiliarized with the requirements of treating their patients in the cold climate of Canada and of preventing such ailments that could be prevented. Empirical observation was the first step in categorizing and ameliorating the effects of the cold. So in conclusion, the effects of the interaction between the European bodies of British soldiers and sailors with the cold realities of the Canadian and Northeastern American winter were well understood within 18th and early 19th century medical models. Drastic changes in temperature require the constitution of the individual body to adapt, a process that was required even if that body had come in contact with such a particular climate before. The regions north of the Chesapeake and the upper 13 colonies and what would become Canada had one defining characteristic. These lands had the potential for extreme cold in the same way that the West Indies had the potential for extreme heat. Although British military and naval medical practitioners did not discuss the seasoning of the body that must or may take place in the Canadian climate in the same way that they did in the West Indies, the cold of winter was still something that must be prepared for. Special medical and preventative items such as clothing, fuel, and medicine must be laid in to help the sick, injured, and ordinary soldiers make it through the winter. Frostbite and inflammatory fevers had distinct medical treatments. Meanwhile, hospitals and other military installations must be constructed capable to withstand the weather, while maintaining a ventilated environment, even if snow could drift through open windows. So thank you very much, and I welcome your questions.
Okay, I've got one, Erin, Evelyn. I'm just wondering why they weren't relying more on local